our moderator, Ken Rubin, is second. But first, I wanted to tell you that the first Politicon was 3 years ago. We had 138 tickets sold with a couple of weeks to go. This year, we're going to have 10,000 people. So thank you for having us. And this is a phenomenal panel on Watergate. Our host, Ken Rudin. Ken, what's the name of your podcast?
Ken Rudin's Political Junkie.
Ken Rudin's Political Junkie for 20 years. You were the political director for NPR.
I was NPR Political Director 20 years and 10 years ABC News Deputy Political Director.
So he is qualified to moderate this panel.
And I'm old.
Now, Ken is also one of the great collections of political memorabilia. Ken, how many items in your collection?
70,000 campaign buttons.
70,000 campaign buttons. And what is, give me like the top two that you have.
One of my favorite ones, it's a great one, is from 1962. The top button is from California. The top part of the button is the color brown. The bottom part of the button is the color pink. And in the middle it says IS. So if you look at this and what does this mean? It's a Richard Nixon button against Pat Brown. Brown is pink from 62.
And somehow he lost. Okay, I'm going to turn this over to you.
Okay? Yeah. First of all, thank you all for being here. This is a, shall we say, an unimpeachable panel of some good guests. Let me introduce them to my left, or to my far left, as I say. No, actually, not the far left. But Congressman Brad Sherman, first elected to First elected to Congress in 1996, and is serving his 11th term. And he has introduced legislation to impeach the President of the United States. Not the current president, but just one of the presidents. Roger Stone, who has been around politics for a long time. I think his campaign experience goes back to the Nixon campaign. He worked for Ronald Reagan. He worked for Jack Kemp, and I don't know if I can mention this. He worked for Arlen Specter, which I still don't understand. Love the Arlen Specter. But Roger Stone, of course, is shall we say, a longtime confidant of the president, Donald Trump.
Long-time supporter, sir.
Long-time supporter. Okay. Jill Wine-Banks is a contributor to MSNBC. She's a former assistant prosecutor during something called Watergate. So, I'm not sure what that was, but maybe we'll bring up some old memories. But you were there during the Rosemary Woods testimony, where she kind of erased those tapes by accident. And James Carville hardly needs an introduction, but James Carville, of course, is heavily responsible for the election of Bill Clinton in 1992, and of course has a lot of other successes in his long career. What I'm most impressed with, of course, is the Harris Lawford win in 91 in Pennsylvania, but that's because I don't know what else to talk about. But James Carville knows his stuff and been around, and a lot of the Democrats listen to his words. So with that, the reason, obviously, there's an elephant in the room, and of course it is what we're seeing now in the White House. There is a special committee, there's congressional committees going on investigating the president. There is discussion about obstruction of justice. Nothing is proven, but there are things out there that remind some people of Watergate and perhaps even the Clinton impeachment. Of course, we know that anybody on the panel knows this. Name the last president who was impeached and removed from office by the Senate.
No such thing.
Never, right. So this is what the opposition to Trump is up against, but this is what we'll talk about for now. Let me start with you, Jill, because you were a special assistant prosecutor, deputy prosecutor under Leon Jaworski, is that correct?
Started under Archibald Cox.
Archibald Cox. So do you see parallels? I mean, of course, again, the president, remember, the break-in in Watergate was June of '72. The Irvin hearings was the spring of '73. The Sunday Night Massacre was October of '73. Nixon didn't resign until August of '74. 2 years. We're talking about 6 months into this presidency, but do you see a parallel?
I see so many parallels that we could spend the rest of this panel talking about the parallels. And some of them are the obvious things, like both involved a break-in at the DNC. One was a physical break-in, one was electronic. They both involved a very colorful cast of characters that honestly I thought you would never be able to make up another cast as funny as the Watergate cast, and now I look at what is going on and it's the same kind of cast of characters. They both involve obstruction of justice. It is irrelevant whether there is collusion in Trumpgate. It's irrelevant what the underlying crime is, although here it's potentially much more dangerous because it involves a foreign government interfering with democracy in our election. That is much worse than just breaking into the DNC. But that's irrelevant. The acts of obstruction are what we ought to focus on. That's what's dangerous. We can't have a president who's trying to fire Mueller, a president who fired Comey, a president who's interfering in every way with the Department of Justice. I never thought I'd be supporting Sessions, but I hope he stays and doesn't give an opportunity to replace Mueller. So there are just numerous ones. There's an 18.5-minute gap, which you've alluded to, which was the Rosemary stretch explanation. And then we had an 18-day delay for firing Flynn after we knew that he had been compromised by the Russians. So there's millions of things. And then there's the personalities of the two presidents. Both of them were insecure. Both of them have grandiose ideas of themselves. And both of them are amoral. And I think those are the things that have led to, I don't know, well, Scaramucci said the fish stinks from the head. And I think that's what's applicable here. Even
Did somebody just yell impeach or warrant? I couldn't hear what you said. James Carville, you were involved obviously as the top strategist for Bill Clinton. He was also impeached by the House. Do you see comparisons between Clinton and Trump, and do you think there was a Democratic argument to be made 6 months into the presidency of Donald Trump for impeachment?
Well, let me start by thanking Congressman Sherman for giving me a comb. I'll be glad to put it to good. No, I don't see, I really don't see very much of a parallel. If, as I recall, the Bill Clinton thing was about consensual sex. I don't know, let's see where this goes, but I think it's something a little more serious than consensual sex. But, we'll see where it goes. But there's some people that have drawn an analogy between Starr and Mueller. Starr, if you remember, Fisk was the original special counsel, I guess it was independent counsel back then. We didn't say anything. We know who Starr was. And actually, I can't stand him. I never did. I wrote a book and said I just don't like the guy. And I still don't like him. And I thought he was the wrong choice, and I think history has proven it right.
Roger, you worked for both Richard Nixon and Donald Trump and have good feelings about both. You were quoted not that long ago when you said that Watergate and Trumpgate, whatever you want to call it, is apples and oranges. Do you feel that way?
Well, I do see some parallels between Watergate and today. I speak specifically of the document released by the FISA court in November that, without any question, said there were willful, knowing, illegal, unconstitutional surveillance of tens of thousands of Americans for political purposes under Barack Obama. And I'm wondering where the outrage of the New York Times and the Washington Post and those who are outraged by Watergate are regarding these crimes. They're certainly crimes far more egregious than what we saw at Watergate. In the question of Russian collusion or Russian involvement, where is the underlying crime? What is the crime that Mr. Mueller is investigating? We still don't have evidence of a crime. We have allegations, but yet before the two congressional committees or in the activities of the media, we still don't have evidence of a crime.
How about ethics?
Watergate started with a crime, the
How about
break-in
ethics?
into the Watergate complex of the Democratic National Committee. And it went, as you may remember, downhill from there. So I do see the parallels, but I think the parallels are between the abuses of the Nixon administration and the abuses of the Obama administration.
Why are we talking about Obama 2017?
If you get a memo that says in the subject, subject line, a person associated with the Kremlin has dirt on Hillary Clinton, does that sound like, and Donald Trump Jr., the son of Jared Kushner, and Paul Manafort all go to this meeting and they see this in the subject line, does that seem a little bit like collusion to you?
First of all, such a meeting would not be a crime.
I'm not saying it's a crime.
Secondarily, in a presidential campaign, if someone came to you and said, I have documented evidence of wrongdoing by your opponent, you'd be guilty of malpractice not to determine whether what they came to you with was accurate. The fact that the Russian woman lawyer got into the country without a visa and was allowed into the country by the FBI, I find that troubling. I find the pictures of her at Hillary Clinton demonstrations, I find that troubling. The pictures of her in Senator McCain's office, I find that troubling. Yeah, I smell what's called a setup. That's what I smell.
I just point out that it is illegal to accept anything of value from a foreign national.
And since nothing of value was received, there's no crime.
There was an intent to receive, and that is a crime.
I broke in, but I didn't steal anything.
You'd lose.
But it's like if you walk into a bank, if you walk into a bank and about to rob the bank and there's no money there and you walk out, does that not mean that there's some crime?
I think the breaking in of the bank is probably a crime.
Okay, well, we have Congressman Sherman here who has introduced legislation in the House to impeach the president. Now, you know, before we go on, you know what it takes to impeach a president. Explain what has to be done first.
Well, I took an oath of office to defend the Constitution, which provides for the impeachment of a president for high crimes and misdemeanors. What we saw in Watergate was it's not the initial crime, it's the cover-up. Nixon was never impeached, nor were there articles of impeachment that said he planned or colluded with the initial burglars. He was impeached for obstruction of justice. So the question before us is whether there's obstruction of justice that's been shown by clear and convincing evidence. Obstruction of justice applies when you use threats to stop an ongoing FBI criminal investigation. This seems to have happened on at least 2, perhaps 3 occasions. First, Comey was threatened if he didn't lay off the criminal investigation of Flynn. Second, Comey was fired, and the president tells us on the record to Lester Holt that that was intended to interfere with, delay, lift the weight of the investigation of the Russian collusion. And then third, we've got statements made by the president kind of warning Mueller not to look at his personal finances. Now, for something to be obstruction of justice, you can be convicted of obstruction of justice even if your attempt is unsuccessful or inept, or if you obstruct justice 2 or 3 times unsuccessfully in an amateurish way. I don't think these people who were threatened were deterred, but if you take a look at section 1512b3 of the criminal code, you'll see something that you'll see the code defining as a felony obstruction of justice, and it applies to what Trump has done. And with the first instance, we have the sworn testimony of a recipient witness who's highly regarded in law enforcement circles. And, you know, it's not like Comey is like a big fan of Hillary Clinton or a Bernie crowd. This guy wanted to serve and did serve in the Trump administration. And yet he has testified that he was threatened in order to get him to drop the investigation of Flynn, and fired in order to prevent his investigation of the collusion. As to what is the crime, you know, with Watergate, We'll never know what the burglars were looking for. We certainly don't know that Richard Nixon was personally involved in that burglary. It's the obstruction of justice. And likewise, we may never know whether the Trump campaign colluded with the Russian hackers. It was clear it was a crime. The Russians committed a crime. The cyber burglary is as much a crime as burglary. The Russians committed a crime. We'll never know whether they colluded, or we may never know whether they colluded with the Trump campaign. But we do know that we have obstruction of justice. It's not the crime, it's the cover-up.
I just ask you a question. So when he fired Comey, the investigation didn't stop. The investigation into the Russian hacking and the Russian attempted collusion or alleged collusion didn't stop. So how is that obstruction of justice if the investigation wasn't deterred at all?
Obstruction of justice applies even when you attempt it and it doesn't work. If you kill, if you know that the police is coming over and you hide the murder weapon in a place where they find it, it's still obstruction of justice. You threaten a witness and the witness says screw you and they go testify anyway, it's still obstruction of justice. Obstruction of justice is when you attempt to impede justice. Doesn't matter whether you're successful in it or not.
Roger, when the Congressman was talking earlier about Russian involvement, and you were shaking your head no.
First of all, that the Russians hacked the DNC is entirely unproven. You can repeat it as a flat statement, but there is still no evidence that proves it. The fact that
17 intelligence agencies.
do you have the same level of outrage about the unconstitutional?
Don't change the subject. Don't change the subject.
Please.
Did you introduce articles of impeachment against Barack Obama back in November?
Roger,
Or do those crimes unmatter?
You've just admitted.
Please, we're not going to be able to get anything done if you keep
You've
spitting.
just admitted that my arguments are highly persuasive because your only response is not that Trump hasn't committed high crimes and misdemeanors, but that there's some other problem somewhere.
Well, no, that you're
I mean, OJ's guilty too.
That you're-
OJ's a bad guy, but that's not a reason not to impeach Donald Trump.
That you don't have the evidence to impeach Donald Trump, and that your motivation is entirely political, and that you have a
That's what
different
impeachment is. That's
standard of
what
justice for
impeachment
one president than other. That's my point.
James?
If Barack Obama illegally, and clearly we say this, tap people's phone, well, you have the Justice Department, you have the courts, you have the Congress. For God's sakes, go out and indict him. What are you talking about?
You're exactly
You have to
right.
have- why not?
He's exactly right.
Wait,
I'm wondering what Jeff Sessions
let me
wins.
ask you, again, you say this, and people just, well, indict him. Indict him, take your case to the people, man.
Couldn't agree
And then
more.
you say, wait, 17 different intelligence agents said the Russians hacked in to the election. General Kelly yesterday said the Russians came into the election.
The same-
You're the last
the same
person
17
in
who told us that
America
Saddam
that
Hussein
denied
had
that the
weapons of
Russians
mass
tried to
destruction.
conduct the
Please.
election.
16 years ago, some people, hey?
Conceded nothing.
17.
Back to your district, you have conceded nothing.
The best argument you have against impeaching Donald Trump is to say Obama's bad and Brad's bad and Hillary's probably bad too. That may or may not be true. OJ's
Here's the
bad.
difference. The evidence I put forward came from a declaration by the FISA court. You've got a series of allegations that are entirely
I have the
unproven.
sworn
Alex Jones tell you
testimony
that?
of the man that Donald Trump
The
said.
same man who perjured himself in front of the House Intelligence Committee about the surveillance going on under Obama.
This is the man selected initially by Donald Trump to head the FBI. Then you've got the statements made by Donald Trump on videotape to Lester Holt. What was Trump lying? And then you've got the statements made warning Mueller from the mouth of Donald Trump. So you've got sworn testimony plus videotape plus audio tape. What more do you need?
In view of the fact that Mr. Mueller auditioned for Mr. Comey's job, he is hopelessly conflicted in this matter, and on that basis alone.
You guys hired him.
Wait. Mueller is compromised because he wanted to be, he wanted to
Because
serve as a
he interviewed with the president for Comey's job after he stepped down.
So?
That's a very clear conflict. It would provide a motive.
He served as FBI director under two presidents, Republicans and Democrats.
Neither one of which I liked. Go ahead.
Here's my
Wait,
question.
Donald Trump didn't fire Mueller for a conflict of interest. He threatened Mueller to try to prevent him from continuing the investigation if it dealt with Trump's finances.
Unproven.
That's obstruction of justice.
Unproven.
It's on audio tape.
No,
Listen
it's
to
an allegation. No,
It's not.
You don't have grounds for impeachment. Nice
You
try.
know, I got the audio tape, the videotape with the sworn testimony.
Let's see how your legislation does.
First of all, the congressman is right, but second of all, impeachment is different than an indictment. Impeachment is a political thing. It doesn't require a crime. It requires whatever Congress thinks is a threat to democracy.
Okay, now the follow-up question, obviously, is that Richard Nixon was impeached with a Democratic Congress, Bill Clinton was impeached with a Republican Congress. You have a Republican Congress and certainly a Republican Judiciary Committee where your bill would go. Given what we've seen from the House and Senate so far regarding Donald Trump, and we're only talking about 6 months into this presidency, what are the odds of a Republican Congress impeaching this president? Now, I agree it's political, but...
I'm not going to make a political judgment of that. But I will say that what we need is an investigation. And Roger, any investigation starts with circumstantial evidence, with suspicions. That's what an investigation is. You look for the facts. You don't start out, when I started in Watergate, we didn't know that it was going to lead to the president. That was never anything that we had any reason to believe. As we started questioning witnesses, as we found out there were tapes, and as we got the tapes and heard the crimes being committed in the Oval Office, that's when we knew we had a crime. But you have to take this one step at a time. If you stop the investigation, and remember, the smoking gun in Watergate was less than a week after the break-in. You hear Richard Nixon and Haldeman, his chief of staff, who was replaced by a general, much like what just happened in the White House now, saying, let's use the CIA to stop the FBI. Have the CIA director tell the FBI to stop the investigation into the money because it will threaten national security. What it would have threatened is showing that the money that paid those burglars came from the committee to re-elect the president. That's where it came from. Then the cover-up money came from CREEP and it came from the White House. That's what we discovered by an investigation. That's what we need to do now.
We're assuming that Trump has not had these White House conversations taped because basically, if Richard Nixon didn't have these tapes, there would be not much of a case against him. My question is, the break-in was June of '72. 5 months later, Richard Nixon was reelected with 49 states out of 50 states.
Yes.
As a prosecutor, when did you think that, oh my goodness, is something bigger than what we have here, is something bigger than what we expected?
Well, I read the Washington Post right after the break-in, and as a prosecutor in the organized crime section, I had an instinct that there was not just a second-rate burglary as the White House described it, that it was something more. But it wasn't until really March when James McCord, one of the burglars, in trying to get himself a better deal on sentencing after he had been convicted of the burglary, wrote to Judge Sirica and said, "You're right, Judge Sirica, there's much more involved here. People lied on the stand, they said there was no one involved when there was. Hush money has been paid to keep us quiet." That was the first clue. Then John Dean started to cooperate. Now, would John Dean have been believed against the president? I'd say I'd give the benefit of the doubt to the president. But then, in July, John Dean started cooperating in about April, maybe even earlier. July, just a few months later, we find out from Alexander Butterfield there's tapes. We have to then decide, what tapes do we ask for? There's going to be claims of executive privilege. We won't get them. We have to be able to prove that they were in furtherance of a crime or the courts won't give them to us. We picked 9 tapes, mostly based on John Dean's testimony and White House logs of when there were meetings and phone calls. And then he stonewalled, the president stonewalled. And it wasn't until after the Saturday Night Massacre when he said, okay, because there was a public outcry and people were disgusted and fed up, he realized he couldn't keep stonewalling. He said he'd turn them over. Then he said, well, all except 3 that are missing. And then a month later, in really bad trial tactics, he said, oh, and there's another one with an 18.5-minute gap. And then he finally was forced by the courts to turn them over. And we didn't get the smoking gun tape until much later when we issued a trial subpoena after the indictments. So that's how it developed. It just takes time to get there.
Roger, I agree with you that I don't think there's proof yet, and there's no tapes yet. We're also talking about a 2-year investigation into Nixon, and this was just 6 months. And I don't like to talk about hypotheticals, but it seems clear in my eyes that there's no question that the president is trying to get rid of Jeff Sessions. And the follow-up thought is that he would get a more pliable attorney general, somebody who's not recused himself, who somebody could fire Robert Mueller. I'm not saying it's going to happen, but it could happen. If the president picked a new attorney general who would fire Bob Mueller or Rosenstein or whoever's investigating it, that's not proof of wrongdoing, but could you see the argument of obstruction of justice?
It's a hypothetical question.
Sure it is.
First thing I learned in politics,
No, it
don't
is.
answer hypothetical questions.
Yeah, but I'm told to ask them.
It's impossible to say. I think the president's displeasure with Jeff Sessions has to do with the fact that he has not pursued the crimes of the previous administration pertaining to surveillance and spying on American citizens. I was one of those. No problem with cause to look at my email or to my cell phone calls or to my email. I am anxious to testify before the House or Senate Intelligence Committee. I've asked for no immunity, but I would like to testify in public. I don't require a subpoena, I'll come voluntarily. But it ought to be in public. It ought to be in public because they assailed me in public. I was demeaned in public. I was defamed in public. I should have a chance to respond in public. What we saw on the 24th when I was supposed to testify is that Michael Caputo, who is a young man who is a close friend of mine, someone I've worked with for a number of years, did testify. He was not allowed to have a copy of the transcript. He was not allowed to see a copy of the transcript. And then the day after that, a member of the House, of your party, accused him of perjury. Without access to the transcript, he is unable to defend himself. That's why these hearings ought to be in public.
Public, and that's because everyone in this room and everyone in this country should know what went on.
Agreed.
Agreed. Going back to this idea of firing Sessions, I think the president tipped his hand. It is now clear that the Senate will not go on recess, so he can't make a recess appointment. We smelled the fact that he wanted to get rid of Sessions and then put in somebody else on a recess appointment. If he fires Sessions now, they won't even have hearings on confirmation perhaps till next year. And the first, second, and 50th question will be, do you promise not to fire Mueller? So any idea that by firing Sessions, you're going to be in a position to fire Mueller, the stronger argument for the president would be to say that the regulations that provide that a president cannot fire a special counsel are somehow unconstitutional under the theory of a single executive. But as long as he's relying on the Attorney General to do it, that isn't going to happen. But I want to get back to the idea of what's going to happen in Congress. The parallels to Watergate are there. About a year after we discovered the Watergate burglary, articles of impeachment were filed. And a year after that, they were voted on just in the Judiciary Committee, and only 1/3 of the Republicans voted for them, even though they'd had the tapes. About a year after we discovered the cyber burglary of the Democratic National Committee, articles of impeachment were filed. And perhaps a year from now, and as you point out, we have a Republican Congress, there will be a vote in the Judiciary Committee. For that to happen, you would need a bigger wave of public concern than we had in 1974, because the rule, which is the second thing that Hastert is famous for, the Hastert rule, is that you don't go forward with something unless you have a majority of Republicans with you. So to try to get Goodlatte to hold hearings in the Judiciary Committee is going to take a larger public outcry than what we had in 1974.
James, Whenever Nancy Pelosi is asked about impeachment, she always says it's premature, we don't even want to talk about it. During the Iraq War, when some on the left wing of the Democratic Party talked about impeachment of Bush and Cheney, she said, get this off the table immediately. She's saying the same thing about Congressman Sherman's resolution. What's your
actually, the Congressman is a good friend of mine. I actually agree with Vito Pelosi and not him. I think that what we need to do is Mueller is going to get to the bottom of this thing. It's going to be a lot faster than people think, because and let's see what he says. But I actually will take issue. I think the talk of impeachment right now it's not right. It's a little premature, but you're a member of Congress and you have to be your constituents. Answer me, and that's fine. But
let me point out first, if Nancy introduced articles, that's 100 decibels. If I do it, it's 10 decibels.
I would advise Democrats not to talk about impeachment right now.
That may be, but I wanted to come here and talk about monetary policy, and they wouldn't have me here to talk about monetary policy. The Democratic message has got to be low interest rates and more quantitative easing. That's what will put more people to work, but conferences like this would prefer to talk about Watergate impeachment, so who am I to say otherwise?
I want to point out is, so you offered an article on impeachment just to be on this panel?
No. I'm just pointing out that the fact that I can even speak with 10 decibels is because when I yell about monetary policy, I can't even get up to 1 decibel. The other thing I'll point out is that one of the effects of talking about impeachment, my articles are a tiny part of the overall conversation, is that Republicans are warning the president, change your behavior. And the best example of that, it's happening privately a lot, but Lindsey Graham saying, don't fire Sessions or they'll be hell to pay. What does he mean by hell to pay? He means impeachment. So the immediate benefit effect of talking about impeachment, my resolution is part of that, is to try to get through to the White House that the recklessness has got to stop. The blurting out of intel to a foreign minister of Russia has got to stop. And if the president, his future, you asked me where the future is. Trump's future is in his own hands. If the recklessness and incompetency stops, I'm not going to have any Republican support for my articles. And if that happens, if we can stop the reckless incompetency, that's not so bad.
Roger, do you, I don't understand why you don't see a Russian angle behind this. I really don't, given the fact that the president is more willing to criticize erstwhile U.S. allies and not criticize Putin. The fact that all the the Podesta emails were leaked and the DNC emails, but not the Republicans. And the fact that you've talked about your relationship with WikiLeaks at some point, hinting that they were to come, and then you said, oh, you're just boasting, but it happened like a day or two before all these emails.
Which is contained in the WikiLeaks tweets of July.
Right.
So this is not hardly a state secret.
No, I'm not saying it's a secret, but the fact is that you see all these connections with Russia, the fact that they'll meet, that Trump, that Trump Jr. and Manafort and Kushner will meet somebody who says, associate of Kremlin meeting with dirt on Hillary. Al Gore apparently was offered some kind of dirt on Bush in 2000 and went to the FBI. Would that not have been a foreign power is offering a foreign government, perhaps an adversary government, is offering something to the Trump campaign about his opponent? That doesn't concern you at all.
First of all, we don't know that the Russian woman in question worked for the Russian government.
That's what it said in the email.
No, it doesn't say that.
What does it say in the subject line?
I don't believe it says that.
It says associate of Kremlin has dirt on Hillary Clinton.
And she ended up having nothing.
She ended up
having nothing.
We don't know that she
but they went to the meeting.
We know that they're denying they got nothing.
Well,
That's
is
all
there
we know.
evidence that she had something?
There was a lot released.
I'm sure
My favorite little factoid about Russian interference is that the famous picture of General Flynn at the table with Putin at the RT banquet. there is a partial shot on the back of the head of a female. Does anybody know who that female was? Jill Stein. The Russians were funding Jill Stein's campaign. And we actually had people that voted for who were duped by the Russians. So, and then she went on RT and criticized human rights abuses in the United States and not Russia. Just a little fact. Just a little fact.
So Roger, once again, I know you've heard this over and over again, and you look very dismissive of this whole conversation. But the fact is, Manafort does have ties to pro-Russian people in Ukraine, right? He represented them.
He worked for a Democratic political party in an election, the result of which our State Department recognized. Well, yes.
Right.
And then he convinced the Ukrainian president to join the European Union, completely contrary to what Putin and the Russians.
Is this the president that fled to Russia?
The president who was illegally deposed and thrown out of town, not by impeachment, not by an election, but run out of town by a mob? Yeah, that president.
And then you have Michael Flynn denying meetings with Russians that turned out to be true.
From what I can see, General Flynn is guilty of gross stupidity. I still don't see the crime.
If you were, I'm just starting off with it. If you were a Democratic consultant and you were watching all these things happen, I mean, it just seems like now you've known Donald Trump for a long time, and you obviously have strong feelings for him, but you don't see anything suspicious, worrisome at all.
Here's what I do know. Donald Trump does not favor war over Syria. He does not favor the expansion of the proxy war. He did not favor a no-fly zone. No, I think his position when it comes to Russia is one of détente. He has no illusions about the Russian system. He knows it's a rotten system. He knows that they oppress gays and Christians and Jews. He knows that Putin is a killer. But thermonuclear war over Syria, bad idea. Bad idea. Hillary Clinton would, and the neocons who have dominated the State Department under both Republicans and Democrats, favored expansion of the proxy war.
How do we know that's the way he feels? He never told me that. Have you ever heard, you heard Roger say we know the president? Have you ever heard Trump say that in the campaign? So how do we know? We know you said that's what he thinks, but he ever told us and he has an opinion on everything. He was admiring of Putin in the campaign. I don't understand. Why can't he say that?
Say what?
What you just said. That he knows Putin's a murderer.
Because when you're
I never heard him say that.
When you're going to negotiate over world peace with somebody, you don't start by kicking him in the balls.
But
That's
if
why.
you knew someone was a murderer, wouldn't you call him a murderer? You wouldn't say, you strong leader, what's wrong with Russia? I like Russia. But you wouldn't do that if you thought the guy was a murderer and you disagreed with him and all that. I don't, we're just like coming up with vapid out of thin air saying this is what he thinks.
Let me just get off this somehow. Jill made a good point that impeachment is more about politics than legality, and the one difference I think of the three presidents we're talking about, Nixon, Clinton, and Trump, is that Trump right now has 36% approval ratings. Richard Nixon in the spring of '74 had like a 24%. Bill Clinton throughout the whole impeachment, I think and his numbers were about 60%. So I think one of the differences we saw between Clinton and Nixon is that, as you point out, or you pointed out, I think, Jill, that at least some of the Republicans on the Judiciary Committee, the Hamilton Fishes and the more moderates, supported impeachment. No Democrats supported impeachment with Clinton. So I just wonder how strong of an issue is popular opinion when it comes to this.
Well, also keep in mind that it was 3 Republican leaders who went to Richard Nixon and said, if you do not resign, you will be impeached and convicted. It was Senator Barry Goldwater who led that group, and that's what led to his resignation. It was when they finally saw the truth. They heard the June 23rd tape, which said, use the CIA to stop the FBI. The president had been saying all along, I didn't know anything about this cover-up, I didn't know anything about the burglary, and clearly, within days of the burglary, he was leading the cover-up. And I believe that Congress and the American people will get to the same point when they see real facts. They will stop being partisans and they will start being Americans, and they will support whatever is the right outcome.
Roger.
Between 1974 and today. In 1974, you had a monolithic mainstream media. ABC, NBC, CBS, the New York Times, and the Washington Post, the two national newspapers, really, in a way, the Times and then later the Post. Today, thanks to the internet, the fact that more than 50% of the people are getting their political news through their handheld device, or their PC, or their computer, and there through the internet, you have a vibrant and robust alternative media, left, right, and center. There is no longer one narrative. Yeah, it took a year of the mainstream media, actually a year and a half, to reach critical mass for the removal of Richard Nixon. You are not going to have a monolithic mainstream media. You're not going to have a monopoly on the dissemination of political information by 3 networks, which is why an attempt to impeach Donald Trump will fail.
It's very clear that Donald Trump is afraid of this. He wouldn't be talking about Sessions. He hasn't evaluated any of his performance in the Department of Justice except not whether he makes America safe, but whether he makes Trump safe. He's supposed to make America safe. He's talking about little else. He is afraid of this, but the future of Trump is in Trump's hands. If we see competence and care, if we see impulse control, he's not going to be impeached.
You keep bringing the Clinton thing in. Let me ask the audience something. How many of you have never colluded with Russia in your life? How many of you have never bribed somebody to not admit they committed a burglary? All right? How many of you have never had sex? Okay, that's the difference. That's the difference with happening. People understood what the hell was going on.
Here's a better question. Who in the audience have colluded with Russia? Well, let me ask you a question before I want to get to questions, but let me ask you all, starting with you, James, does Donald Trump survive his term in office?
What do you mean by that?
I don't mean necessity. I mean, no. I'm not making a joke about that at all. I'm just saying the Republic. I'm just saying that does he survive his term? Does he finish his term? Forget about re-election. Does he finish his term in office? James.
No.
I am not sure because I tend to agree with Roger. I can't believe I'm saying this, but I do think that if we don't agree that that is a rectangular table as a fact, then we can't debate what the facts mean. And I think that the multiplication of media channels and gerrymandering, which has led to congressmen being elected who do not have to compromise, who cannot compromise because they'll lose their seat. If we don't agree on the facts, we can't debate the facts. And he may be right that with what's happened now, we will never have a unanimous agreement. But having said that, I think if we follow the money, if we get the tax returns, if we find out what the conflicts of interest are, Americans may be so appalled that there will be the kind of public outcry that will support Congressman Sherman's article of impeachment.
Roger, do you think that the American public deserves to see Donald Trump's tax returns?
Pardon me?
Do you think the American public deserves to see Donald Trump's tax returns?
If you go back to October of last year, I called on him to release his tax returns, yes. I think they should be released.
I just want to say one thing before we get to the decision. A lot of people accuse the media of being liberal. I just want to show you something that I've not shown anybody this before. But
He has a tattoo of Roger Stone on his back.
I've done that for years. I can't explain it.
You're just upset because I'm the only guy you know with a dick on the back and the front. had Nixon put right in the middle. It's not a political statement, it's really not. For me, it's a daily reminder that in life, when you get knocked down, when you are defeated, when you make mistakes, when things don't go the way you want them to, you have an obligation to get them off the mat and get back in the game. It's about resilience, it's about persistence, it's about survival. That said, it's right in the middle of my back, therefore I have the option of adding Goldwater, Buckley, and Reagan for a Mount Rushmore.
I agree about persistence and resilience. I think those are having a problem.
Congressman, your bill for impeachment. You have one co-sponsor so far, Al Green, the singer, I think. No, Congressman from Texas.
The president's fate is in his own hands. If he starts to govern as a competent Republican populist,
You see him changing.
well, I think that the people around him are trying to convince him that he has to change. Look, he's got impulses that he does control. He'd love to fire Mueller and Sessions, and he knows he's been warned not to do that. And so he's got a new chief of staff. And look, having competent Republican leadership working effectively for terrible values is not my first choice. It doesn't necessarily help my political party to throw out a guy that is off the rails and put in somebody that might be a more effective advocate for Republican values. So I think that whether Trump finishes his term is entirely in Trump's hands.
Before we go to questions, I just want to ask the audience, how many people would support impeachment of the president today? And how many would not? So that's what you love about Politicon. Okay, let's take some questions from, are they lining up? Is that what they're doing, or anything? Yeah, okay.
So my question is for Roger. On what planet did it ever become okay to parse the difference between ethical and legal and consider that a valid argument in favor of your president? And a second part of that question is, what the fuck's wrong with you?
On that basis, I decline to answer your question.
So I grew up in the rural Midwest. Now I live in New York City, and I feel like every day we're seeing more and more studies coming out that show that the rural areas are getting redder and redder, and cities are just getting bluer and bluer. I'm worried about the future of bipartisanship. And do you think that this is something that can be overcome when it seems like Democrats and Republicans are just literally interacting less and less with each other every day?
Well, I would think one of the reasons is probably redistricting. The fact is, once upon a time, districts were like 55-45 Republican or 55-45 Democratic, and you had to move over the opposite party to get reelected. Now everything is 80-20, so there's no reason to compromise. But what do you think? Do you think?
Not only do we have gerrymandering, now not in California, where we have an independent commission, not in a lot of states, we have citizen gerrymandering, where people choose to live where they agree with the folks. You've got Whole Foods neighborhoods and Sam's Club neighborhoods. You've got the center of the city and out a bit, and you've got exurbia. And that is one of the problems. And when you look at why we lost the last election, I think a chunk of it is on what people think of hunting. I don't like it. They haven't done it. But if people who hunt in Wisconsin or Western Pennsylvania think that they're being looked down on for bambicide, they're not going to listen to your views on quantitative easing if they think you're looking down on them.
James, you had a solution you were talking about the people who live in California?
I have to answer the question last one. How many people are here from California? How many people here would like to help the Democratic Party? Good, move. Go to Arizona. We're all clustered together in the same place.
Remember, they were talking about during the Bush presidency, they were talking about Texas seceding, which would end Republican presidents forever. If California seceded, that wouldn't help the Democrats either, would it?
I don't need to succeed. We just need to be better distributed.
Yes.
I just feel the need to remind people that the summer of '56 was the big scandal of those years.
Can you speak up a little bit?
I'm sorry.
Can you speak up a little bit?
The big financial scandal of the summer of 1956 was whether Eisenhower aide Sherman Adams accepted a $500 coat and for his papers for the
In 58.
And it sort of shows how low we've come in those 61 years, where you have, this incredible corruption and a pocket flopping her $10,000 bracelet on the 60 Minutes. Then you have all this other money laundering and scandals. I grew up in Rockford, which is a very conservative Republican district. The idea of becoming a Democrat was just impossible. Even in 1990, when I fantasized being some political in a small way, so I'd have to start out with why I was ashamed to be a Republican at that time. It just seems to me appalling that we've come so far and so low. And I think that the thing is just so urgent right now that the impeachment is not quick enough. That people are going to start protesting and general strikes, and I think he's going to be gone by Thanksgiving.
Okay, I heard you somebody say that his approval rating, Trump's approval rating is 37% or something like that? 34, okay. He was elected with a 37% approval rating in many, many polls. So could it be that popularity is not necessarily what people are thinking about, that maybe other factors come into play, perhaps competence or liking his policies or something other than popularity, and that maybe he will never have a high approval rating, but maybe that won't make a difference?
Well, that's a very good point, but also, not only was Donald Trump very unpopular in 2016, his Democratic opponent had very similar low markings as well. I mean, James, is that fair? That both candidates?
It's fair. A couple of points are fair. Yeah, it is certainly fair to say that our nominee was not particularly popular. That's a fair statement. However, if you look at, if you go to 538 or you go to Real Clear Politics, you can track over a period of time his approval and his disapproval. And it's just not true that it stayed the same the whole time. It didn't come from like a 45 to 37. And the disapproval is going up. I mean, that's a kind of a 14, 15 point change on his net overall approval, disapproval. Now, it is true that it remains in the high 30 level among all voters. Polls are different, but and it may be in early American politics where you don't have to think like, Obama and Bill Clinton both left office, as I recall, in the high 50s. But I think Clinton was like in 60. So it's not unheard of. I mean, like when Obama left, I think his approval was 56, 57. That's pretty good. I don't know if that's a chronic condition, but if you go to those sites, they actually have the kind of chart, and you can see how the aggregate polls.
Can I just ask Roger a question? Does the popularity, the 36% approval rating of President Trump, does that matter?
Well, there's a couple of problems. First of all, James is essentially right, but at no time has his approval been above 50, and the fluctuation between 45 and 38 is not that great. I'm not sure. I think the questioner has a point, which is I'm not sure that it's a factor here. In other words, as you pointed out, both Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump were extremely polarizing. We're both carrying enormous, normally what we would call debilitating negatives into the election. And therefore, I'm not sure the approval rating tells us where this is going to go. I don't think we know where it's going to go.
Over 80 Republicans, and all of Trump's critics have one thing in common. They don't have to face Republican voters. So all the critics, the columnists, the this, the that, anybody that's got to face Republican voters in a primary is very reluctant to get out there. So the most important number is not Trump's overall approval. It's his approval among Republicans. Now, there's a lot of research, a lot of people think this, and I suspect it might be true, is that the number of Republican identifiers are down from November. So if you're getting 85% of 40 or you're getting 83% of 37, it makes a difference.
It goes back.
But right now, his saving grace is that he remains high approval ratings among Republicans. So if I'm a Republican congressman, if I vote against him, Roger Stone will come in and raise a lot of money and beat my ass.
But that goes back to Jill's point that it wasn't Peter Rodino and Elizabeth Holtzman who ended Richard Nixon. It was Barry Goldwater, Hugh Scott, John Rhodes, and people like that.
After a year of being beaten on by the only 3 networks we had, yes.
Yeah, he might have got
No
beat up. I mean, he
diversity.
tried to obstruct the justice.
Sometimes you wonder.
If I can chime in on polls, 6 months into his second term, only 24% of Americans thought Richard Nixon should be impeached. Right now, it's 47% of Americans think Trump should be impeached now. But as James points out, you got to win in Republican areas. So it's 47% of the country. It's probably 47% of this room. But it will take another year of catastrophic incompetence before articles of impeachment are passed, and I hope we don't see it. I hope Trump does a good job and raises his approval rating.
If you went by polls, then we know Donald Trump couldn't possibly be elected. So, based on what we saw going in. Now, whether that has to do with incorrect modeling and not understanding who was not going to vote, or whether it has to do with bias, depends on the pollster. But looking at the numbers I looked at before the election, I think Jim disagreed with this, sure looked to me like Hillary Clinton was going to win this.
You know what? The public average was like 3.5 and she won by 2. I mean, it probably can't be much more than that. And my favorite poll is I saw it, they asked, do you think Trump is a good role model for children? 72 said no, 14 yes. Where the hell are these 14%? I would just like to know, what is it?
But
that's the 14%.
That leads to the question, why didn't she win by 20 points? We have time for one more question.
Yes, Alan Dershowitz, one of the most well-respected attorneys in this country, and a die-hard Democrat, has stated that Donald Trump has not committed any crime. So my question to you is, why do you continue to perpetrate falsehoods against our president to hurt our country and the American people?
Alan Dershowitz made that comment at a time when I was not in favor of articles of impeachment. I filed I even went on record that I would begin preparing articles only after the sworn testimony of James Comey. That was after what you quote Dershowitz saying. I agreed with Dershowitz when he said it. It wasn't enough for me to see leaks to the New York Times. I needed to see evidence sworn by a precipitant witness under penalty of perjury. But when I saw that, and then we added, again after Dershowitz's comments, the comments to Lester Holt, and then after that, we see the threats to Mueller, I think Dershowitz might reach another conclusion. I know Larry Tribe already has.
I mean, I would say back then, before you, I mean, that's when I got my Roger's Stone tattoo. I mean, I didn't know what was going on back then. Anyway, my name is Ken Rudin. I have KR Political Junkies, my podcast. I want to thank you for coming. I want to thank this great panel.